Hi, I'm Richie Zellen, and I want to welcome you to the Jazz Guitar channel. Today, I want to talk about a controversial subject when improvising. Wrong notes. Or are they? So let me begin by asking you, have you ever transcribed or simply tried to analyze a solo by one of your favorite players and found that in more than one measure there were notes that absolutely did not relate to the prescribed chord? But here's the strangest thing. You listen to it in context and it doesn't sound wrong. However, you just don't understand why. Well, there are several answers. For example, when we find several notes that contradict the written changes, the player might simply be anticipating the next chord or extending the previous one. Or he might be implying a dominant that resolves to the next chord. But today we are going to explore other not so obvious choices. I think it was Miles who said, "There are no wrong notes," which I believe is true as long as you're listening to a master jazz improviser. Now, for those of you who are not yet master improvisers, does that mean that you can play anything over any chord? Yes and no. I'm not talking about playing free jazz here. Instead, I'm talking about the use of all 12 notes over any chord in a way that you have full control over the degree of dissonance you desire to create against the harmony of the moment. But I want to make it clear that first, you have to learn how to play according to the rules of functional harmony. Only after you are comfortable doing so will you be ready to break those rules. And that's what I want to teach you in this lesson. How great improvisers successfully break the rules. In order to begin to understand what I am going to reveal to you, let's first take a step back and briefly examine a music style that we're all familiar with. And this style employs, at least from the standpoint of established chord scale theory, the use of avoid notes. Personally, I don't like this term, and I think the proper term should be non-harmonic tones. But if you study jazz scale theory, you probably know them as avoid notes. Anyhow, the familiar style I am referring to that uses these non-harmonic tones, sometimes without resolving them, is the blues. Yet we don't seem to have a problem with them in that context, so we don't perceive them as wrong notes. Strange, isn't it? When we play a traditional 3-chord 12-bar blues, it is customary to employ the same minor pentatonic over the entire progression. However, if you analyze it, you'll notice that several of its notes can clash with those 3 chords. Yet we don't hear this, or do we? Here's an analysis of how the notes in an A minor pentatonic relate to the 3 chords in a blues in A. Notice that there is an X above one of the notes or intervals for each of the chords. That's the scale degree of the original A pentatonic that clashes with that chord. And let me play each one of these, and I will briefly rest on each note with an X so you can hear it. So now you'll hear a background A7 chord, the first chord in the progression, and I'm going to play the A minor pentatonic and stop on the 4 that has an X so you can hear what happens. Ooh. Now I'm going to do the same for the second chord, the D7. Hear the D7 in the background. Ooh. And finally over the 5 chord in the blues progression, over an E7. And the first note now is the culprit. Ooh. So why, if there is this so-called wrong note often being played when we listen to the blues, we don't hear it as a wrong note? Simple. It's an acquired taste. You've heard the notes used that way all your life because it has been a part of the blues idiom since its inception. Yet, using those same notes in that manner within classical music or even some jazz is not acceptable to most ears. And it has to do with context. It's even a cultural influence. But I believe it can also be an acquired taste, like I said. For example, the first time I tasted kombucha, I thought it was disgusting. The second time, it wasn't so bad. And today, I considered it an acquired taste. And this is the same reason why some people who first listen to jazz find it awful. Yet with some more exposure to it, especially under the right circumstances, many people develop a taste for it, and some even end up loving it. And this is also one of the reasons why when you analyze a transcription, and in spite of the fact that you find what seem to be wrong notes, when you listen to the recording, it sounds good. You have developed a taste for the use of non-harmonic tones in certain jazz contexts. But what I'm going to teach you next are several concepts many improvisers use that some of you might still have to acquire a taste for. So next I'm going to show you two different categories I like to place these so-called wrong notes in. That is, when I think of them to purposely use them in my playing. And please keep in mind that I'm not talking about the conventional use of chromatic approach note concepts that bebop players have used for almost a century. This is about how to no longer view the use of non-harmonic notes as wrong notes, but instead as resources to achieve different degrees of controlled dissonance. And the first category I want to demonstrate is the use of modal ambiguity. And this can take place when we use one or more notes from a similar parallel mode instead of all the notes from the normal intended scale. And modal ambiguity can be undesirable or desirable. However, before we can use it to our advantage, we first have to know when and why to avoid it. Again, you need to learn the rules in order to break them successfully. Needless to say, using it in the context of a more traditional setting would be undesirable. So we're going to hear a C major 9 in the background. I'm going to play the root in its upper chromatic neighboring tone, which is not diatonic to the C major scale. And it sounds like this.
Ugh, disgusting.
That's very dissonant, ambiguous. Now if I do the same, let's play that chord again. That's non-ambiguous because now I played the upper neighboring tone, which is diatonic, in other words, the natural 2. Let's do the same thing now with the fifth, same chord, and I'm going to play the upper non-diatonic, the chromatic upper neighboring tone. And here it is playing the upper diatonic scale degree after playing the fifth. Now, with this understanding in mind, we can purposely break those rules and use modal ambiguity to introduce an additional degree of dissonance to our lines. If you look at this example, you'll notice that it is all being played over a D minor. By the way, these stretches of over one measure for any given chord are an excellent place to introduce modal ambiguity, or for that matter, any of the upcoming concepts I will introduce in this lesson. Notice that to the right of this example, I have listed what I like to call a modal color palette. It consists of all the degrees I can emphasize within my original D minor scale to create modal ambiguity. Notice that I am thinking of D Dorian as my bass scale here also. In this example, I also call moderate modal ambiguity because its color palette consists of choices only from other parallel minor modes. All of them, of course, have the minor third and the root in common. So I create ambiguity whenever I use the major seventh, the flatted sixth, and the flatted two, which are non-diatonic to the Dorian. Let me play it for you. Oh, and a word of caution. For all the concepts I am examining, you don't want to apply them over a ballad or slow tempo, but instead over a faster medium to up tempo. At slow tempos, they are bound to sound more like wrong notes. In this next example, I am still using the D Dorian as my bass scale, and I am labeling it as a strong use of modal ambiguity this time because, as you can see on the far top right, its modal color palette introduces a major third, which is obviously not from another minor mode. So when combining the notes of two unrelated parallel scales, as is the case here using minor and major, we are in essence coming close to creating what is known as a polytonal line. And this is ambiguity at its extreme. So unless you're a fan of recordings such as Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, you might have to acquire a taste for it. And by the way, I wholeheartedly agree that it's not for everyone. But I'm curious to know what you think of all these concepts either way, so please leave me a comment below. Enough said, let me play this. With this previous example, I began to introduce some elements of the second category I like to think of when breaking the rules using these so-called wrong notes. And it is what many musicians refer to as playing outside. Usually what makes it differ from the previous category is that when we are using various degrees of modal ambiguity as our source, we always introduce just one note at a time from the parallel mode, and we immediately follow it by playing a diatonic note from our bass scale. When I think of playing outside, on the other hand, I am using several notes in a row that belong to an entirely non-related scale, which is usually not parallel. And the simplest way of achieving this is using a concept that is known as side slipping. And it consists of simply departing from the current scale and playing the notes of a scale either a half step below or above it. Notice in this example how I side slip from a D Dorian to fragments of an E flat minor and a D flat minor scale. Let me play it for you. If you'd like to learn a great line by Miles that combines all of these concepts, check out my video, The Miles Monster Lick. You can also download a free PDF with all the examples in this lesson. Just head over to jazzguitar.richiezelland.com and register for my free newsletter. And I will place a link in the info section below for that and for the Miles Monster Lick. This final example represents my favorite way of playing outside. You can hear it extensively in the post-jazz steps playing of John Coltrane, as well as in the playing of McCoy Tyner, Michael Brecker, Herbie Hancock, and countless others. And it consists of superimposing different chord changes against the prescribed harmony. And one of the keys to achieve this successfully is to make sure you always start and end back in the inside harmony before the end of the cadence. And again, if you look at this example, it's over 4 measures of a D minor 7. This could easily be a portion of a modal tune such as So What or Impressions, which, by the way, are great vehicles to explore this concept. And that's because in order to imply a temporary departure from the written progression, that is, it helps to have more than one measure. As a matter of fact, this concept was born after musicians like John Coltrane exhausted the possibilities of what they could do over the changes. That is, they wanted freedom to expand the boundaries of a fixed tonality, to go where no musician has gone before. Space, the final frontier. So with all this information I've shared with you, I hope that the next time you analyze a solo transcription and you run into any notes that don't fit the prescribed changes, you won't simply dismiss them as wrong notes. If you like what they sound like in context, analyze them further to see what you can learn from them. They most likely will fall into one of the categories I've mentioned. As usual, I welcome your likes, comments, and any questions. And if you enjoyed this lesson and this is your first time on the Jazz Guitar channel, please be sure to subscribe. It's time to say hasta la vista, stay safe, and may peace be with you.